Well, we're going to try this again. Today we're going to talk about introductions, introductory paragraphs, um, conclusions, supporting paragraphs, titles. And so I want to kind of give this as a four-way to kind of understand how to put your introduction together without yawning. So, introductions are important. An introduction, there are four main rules to introduction. One, you're supposed to attract the reader's interest and encourage them to continue reading. Now, that can be done in a number of ways, and it's not always easy. I know it's not always easy, so just bear with me. But especially, sometimes it might be on a subject that you think is very deadly dull, and the idea of trying to make something appear more interesting than it is, well, hopefully that's what you're going to do. And especially if it's an important issue, okay? An introduction also supplies background information that the reader is going to need to understand the essay. You have to supply the 3 points, a little bit of background of each premise before you get to that thesis statement. And because it's the premises that are the background information that then are connected together to create that thesis statement. Finally, of course, the introduction and introductory paragraph is going to present a thesis statement. It's distinct, it's the main idea of the essay. It's going to chart the course for the rest of the essay, and it's at the end of the paragraph. It's the last sentence of the first paragraph, okay? Within all this, the complete introductory paragraph indicates that you're going to have a particular plan of development, how you're going to support main points for your thesis statement. You're going to list things in order in which they're going to be presented. It's a path. It's putting in your coordinates in the GPS, okay? And that's what we really want to do. Now, some common methods of introduction. We're going to talk about some of the methods that you can use. One of the ones that's the best, it's the best that's often used, is where you begin with something very broad and you narrow it very quickly. Now, this is good to use, but you have to remember you want to be able to narrow very quickly, and you don't want to have to have a lot of background information. Okay, so here's a good example. Bookstore shelves are crammed with dozens of different diet books. The American public seems willing to try any sort of diet, especially ones that promise instant miraculous results. Authors are more than willing to invent new fad diets to cash in on this craze. Unfortunately, some of these fad diets are ineffective or unsafe. And one of the worst fad diets is the cookie diet. It is impractical, doesn't achieve the results it claims, and is a sure route to poor nutrition. The thesis statement here is the last sentence. What they're talking about is they're going to talk about the cookie diet and why it's such a bad idea. Now, why is this so? All of a sudden you're thinking, well, wait a minute. Now remember, we went from bookstores in the world crammed with diet books to the American public trying to any diet book that's out there, to authors that are willing to invent new fad diets. So it's like a funnel. We have funneled and focused in on a particular topic. And in this particular topic, we're talking about unsafe fad diets. That are really not very good. Now, if you were to begin this introduction in another way, you would also want to include some points about, after miraculous results, you would want to say, okay, often these diets are impractical. Some of the results, you want to talk about what's impractical a little bit. a little bit about why it doesn't achieve those results, and why it's bad nutrition. These are some of the things that you can do. And so this is one example of a way that you can do, start with broad and go to very narrow. Another one is you want to start with an idea or situation that might be the opposite of the one you're starting to develop, okay? And what this example does is it starts you with a preconceived notion that eventually you come to the realization that it's really the opposite of what you really think it is, okay? And this is often a good way to begin with a good essay, thinking, oh, okay, this is kind of interesting. Let's see what they have to say. Now, this is I got this from an essay by a woman who was coming back to school, and she says, "When I decided to return to school at 35, I wasn't all worried about my ability to do the work. I wasn't, after all, I was a grown woman who had raised a family, not a confused teenager fresh out of high school. But when I started classes, I realized that those confused teenagers sitting around me were in much better shape for college than I was. They still had all their classroom skills in bright, shiny condition, while mine had grown rusty from disuse. I had to learn how to use the library's database, how to write a research paper, and even how to speak up in class discussions." Notice 3 things. Last sentence. You can take your finger and point. She's going to talk about 3 things that she had to learn as a new student. And she has turned on its head that notion that older students are really more prepared for college than younger students. She's trying to tell you that that isn't necessarily the case, because, as an older student, I don't use these skills very much. And so because I haven't, I've had to, relearn what the newest skills are and so forth. So, and that's something to think about overall. So this is one way you can start with, is start with something that's sort of the polar opposite of where you're going. And then slowly bring it around and say, but this really isn't the point. And it really focuses that attention. This preconceived notion that older students are better off, now you're thinking, that's sort of been turned on its head. Another thing, too, is to explain the importance of the topic to your reader. Now, this sometimes is a lot easier said than done. Again, with an introduction, it's really important because you want to introduce those points that you're going to talk about, but you don't want to, again, this isn't the main paper, so you don't want to have it too long, okay? So here's a good example here. Diseases like scarlet fever, okay? This is an important one to think about. Diseases like scarlet fever and whooping cough used to kill more young children than any other cause. Today, however, child mortality due to disease has been almost completely eliminated by medical science. Instead, car accidents are the #1 killer of children and young adults under 24. Most of the children fatally injured in car accidents were not protected by car seats, belts, or restraints of any kind. Several steps must be taken to reduce the serious danger car accidents pose to children. Okay, so we've gone from talking about the importance of disease and how it affected children to a man-made issue. And it kind of shows, again, this shows the importance of how we have to make sure we, protect our children in car seats and so forth. It's kind of interesting because on a sideline is I'm old enough to remember that in Michigan we finally had to have car seats, and I don't remember car seats. Yeah, I'm that old. But I do remember when my brother was born that he had a car seat. And that was very, very important. And these things were monstrous. But It was something important my mom really believed in, and this was something new. And the other thing that was new was in Michigan, we had passed a law early on where everybody had to wear a seatbelt. And a lot of people didn't like this law because, well, what they didn't like was being told that they had to do something. A lot of times we hate this thing, folks, and I understand that. But I think it's a minor inconvenience, So here are some of the, that's one thing. Now you can also use an incident or a brief story. Sometimes stories are naturally interesting. They're going to appeal to your curiosity. Sometimes you can use an anecdote that's going to grab the reader's attention, but not just any story. The story should be brief and must be related to your main idea. Okay, you can't just have any old story in there. And the incident in the story doesn't necessarily have to be anything that happened to you. It can be, but it can also be something that happened to somebody else, or something you heard about, or something you read about in a newspaper, magazine, or whatever. And when you think about this, think about this story, and it's kind of crushing when you think about it. Early Sunday morning, the young mother dressed her little girl warmly and gave her a candy bar, a picture book, and a well-worn stuffed rabbit. Together, they drove down to a Methodist church. There, the mother told the little girl to wait on the stone steps until children arrived for Sunday school. Then the young mother drove off, abandoning her 5-year-old because she couldn't cope with being a parent anymore. The incident is one of thousands of cases of child neglect and abuse that occur annually. Perhaps the automatic right to become a parent should no longer exist. Would-be parents should be forced to apply for parental licenses, for which they would have to meet 3 important conditions, and she would go on there. But think about, when you think about this, this kind of is, in my mind, this is a nice, easy way to ease you into this story about parental licenses, because you're thinking, this is just, it's almost like reading a piece of fiction. It's a nice sunny day. You can picture mom dressing up her little girl, putting her in the car, dropping her off at church. Yeah. And then what happens? Well, what happens, as we know, is, this goes into a story unlike what you thought. It becomes a story of child neglect. And this certainly catches somebody's eye. You've now really trapped somebody into this story. And it's certainly something that you could think of. Now, sometimes, other ways, I don't always recommend this. It's okay to use a quotation, but again, it's got to be relevant. It has to be, it can be something you've heard, a popular saying, a popular proverb, even an advertising slogan that might be out there on a billboard, but it's got to be relevant. Okay. I have a good quote that one of my friends used to have. My friend used to have this quote. He says, "My father always used to say, you can't tell what's in the pickle barrel till you get the lid off it." Okay, story like that, funny, a little strange, but it's only going to be helpful for a particular kind of story or an essay. And so you can't just use it for anything, okay? And so it's kind of important that you make sure it's relevant, okay? Here's a good one. And this was a true one. "Fish and visitors," wrote Benjamin Franklin, "begin to smell after 3 days. Last summer, when my sister and her family came to spend their two-week vacation with us, I became convinced that Franklin was right. After only 3 days of my family's visit, I was thoroughly sick of my brother-in-law's corny jokes, my sister's endless complaints about her boss, and their children's constant invasion of our privacy." Boom. There you go. We know what he's going to talk about, but he had a neat little quote that kind of eased into this. Fish and visitors, get stale after 3 days or spoiled or whatever. And that's kind of important, okay? Another way to do things is to include a statistic or a startling statement in there as well. Some essays are going to begin with statements of statistics. Sometimes they'll have numerical data that may shock readers and get them intrigued to want to read more. Some will use both, but again, relevance is important. So here's a good one here that was out there, and believe it or not, I actually included this before the pandemic occurred. The Spanish influenza was a pandemic that occurred between 1918 and 1920, reaching every corner of the earth, including the Arctic and the most remote Pacific islands. Unlike most other flus, this one attacked healthy young men and women primarily, not the very old or the very young. Scientists estimate that the disease killed 50 to 100 million people worldwide. Keep that in mind. That's startling. Even more significantly, the Spanish flu was caused by a strain of the H1N1 virus that threatens the world today. Timely. You've started a story here, and it's shocking. And 50 to 100 million people, that's kind of interesting. And, people are going to pay attention to that because today we have reached a number throughout the world where, the number of people killed by the recent virus is just absolutely stunning. Sorry about that, guys. I didn't mean to do that. I was going to look it up real quick. But, it hasn't reached the numbers of 50 and 100 million. And the thing you have to remember, it happened beginning in 1918. So what's going on in 1918? World War I. And so what's happening is a lot of governments, including the U.S. government, really had a control over the press and what they could print. And so a lot of warning, a lot of notions about the flu were not disclosed to the public right away, which could have prevented the spread of the disease as well. So there's some things out there to think about. So these are common introductory ideas where you bring in the reader to think about what you're going to write about, and then you also are going to discuss the importance and timely points about that you're going to introduce. So remember, the importance of an introduction is to grab your reader's attention, briefly introduce them to your three premises, and then end with the thesis statement. The thesis statement's got to be that last sentence of that first paragraph because it brings that whole flow in. Now, it may sound a little wooden, and that's probably because you haven't done it a lot. And I understand that. And many of us in education tend to make it look easy because we do it all the time. But it's important to do that because the thesis statement it brings everything together and tells you what you're going to do for the next 3-4 paragraphs or pages. Now, once you've done all this, the next thing is to talk about our concluding paragraphs. What do we do here? And this is where you have to remind your reader of your thesis, your idea, and you're going to bring the paper to a natural and graceful end, if there is such a thing. And sometimes, there are ways to do that. Most common method is you're going to end with a summary and a final thought, okay? When Army instructors, here's a good example. When Army instructors train new recruits, each of their lessons follow a 3-step formula about whatever they have to do. So, and here is our formula. You're going to end with a summary and a final thought. First, you tell them what you're going to tell them, okay? So you're going to remind them about the 3 premises that you talked about, okay? You'll say something along the lines of, and this is why that putting the most important premise and cause as the last one is important, because people are going to remember that one. And then when they get to the conclusion, you're going to remind them of the first 2 things and then bring in the third. And so you're going to tell them what you're going to tell them, which you've already done. You're going to tell them, so you're going to restate your thesis and supporting points. So we've done this. And then you're going to tell them what you told them. And that is what it's kind of like in this conclusion. You're going to tell them, you know, evidence shows A, B, C. And as stated previously, you don't want to you're going to restate the thesis, but you don't have to, you know, you're not going to restate it word for word. You're going to kind of show how these 3 points really come together to form that thesis statement. And then, you know, you're going to tell them at the end how this kind of brings together. Now, an essay that ends with a summary is not very different. You know, you've stated your thesis, you know, you've gone through all these supporting points. And you're going to restate the main supporting points a little bit to kind of give an idea. And then you're going to tell them what you told them, but you don't want to use the exact wording like we said. So look at here's a concluding paragraph, okay? The idea is you're going to sum up and say, catalog shopping at home then has these advantages. This was an essay on the advantages of catalog shopping. You're reminding them of your thesis and saying, when you say, okay, we were talking about some of the advantage. Shopping is convenient, saves money, and saves time. And then you're going to then you say, it's not surprising that growing numbers of devoted catalog shoppers are welcoming those full-color mail brochures that offer everything from eggplant seeds to electronic devices. So you have reminded them of what your thesis was about, and you reminded them of the 3 premises. You said, you know, like you said here, shopping is convenient, saves money, and saves time. And then you have summed it up and said, look, it's not surprising people are doing this. It's, you know, because of all these advantages. Boom. The summary has that final comment that sort of rounds off the paper, brings this discussion to a conclusion. And that's important because you want to, you don't want to add anything more. Once it's a conclusion. That means there's nothing that comes after, okay? It's like the end. And that's exactly what this is, the end. So in that sense, what you have done is you will have brought this kind of conclusion to, you know, focus this and said, okay, here we are at the end and nothing more. If you add something at the end, all of a sudden you don't want to do something like introduce another point. No. If the point's that important, if another premise is important, then you need to put it in the paper. But if it's not in there, you know, if it's not in your 3 main paragraphs, or if it's not part of that, that's another paper, okay? You know, you want to stay consistent. And once you do that, you know, you've really brought it to a nice conclusion. Sometimes you can include a thought-provoking quotation, sometimes, not always. And sometimes you can end with a recommendation, too. Re-emphasize your point. And sometimes it can help and sometimes it can't, you know. Here's a good one. Actually, was it this one? Yeah. Here's a good one that looks kind of good, too, that I like, too. Is, sometimes, did I do 2 of them, guys? Yes, I did. I'm sorry. So if you have a thought-provoking quotation, it kind of becomes effective, okay? Here's a good one and how you might include it. Rude behavior has become commonplace and needs to stop. Okay, so the whole paper was about rude behavior. And the 3 premises, they're going to remind you of the 3 premises here. People no longer treat each other with respect and courtesy. They talk on their cell phones at inappropriate times and places. They cut off drivers in order to save mere seconds. And this happens more and more often. Okay, so these are the 3 things that they talked about that were, you know, these problems. And so, as the Dalai Lama said, love and kindness are the very basis of society. If we lose these feelings, society will face tremendous difficulties. The survival of humanity will be endangered. Kind of a nice little quotation to sort of round off, you know, that, look, you know, this is rude behavior. We have to stop it. This is one way, another way to do that. But again, it has to be important and it has to be an effective, but also it has to be a relevant quote. It can't just be any old quote, you know. Now, another thing is of course, to end with a recommendation, prediction. We talked about that. Some kind of appeal. This is a good one, too. It becomes more timely as I came from Connecticut, and I'll explain how this is kind of timely. If people stop to think before acquiring pets, there would be fewer instances of cruelty to animals. Many times, it is the people who adopt pets without considering the expense and responsibility involved who mistreat and neglect their animals. Pets are living creatures. They do not deserve to be treated as carelessly as one would treat a stuffed toy. Now, again, it's a recommendation. Think before you do things. I found by living in various places in the United States, I found that one of the worst places where you'll find increased stray animals sometimes is not just the cities. That's another reason, but it's places where there are naval and army bases. Sometimes what happens is a soldier might live off base. They get stationed at a certain place. They get a dog. They get a cat, and then they have to move on a moment's notice, and they can't take the animal with them. So what do you do? And a lot of times they let them go. They let them go out into the wild. They let them, and that's not such a great idea. And a lot of times they end up in shelters, and sometimes they don't. We know that. But my point here is that, concluding this is they're trying to say, look, we got to think before we act. And that's really kind of a good thing to think about. And that's a nice prediction. Sometimes you could have a recommendation that what should be done about a certain problem, and that's kind of helpful too. Here's a good one. Stereotypes such as the helpless homemaker, the harried executive, or the dotty grandparent are insulting to begin with. In online ads or television commercials, they become even more insulting. How these unfortunate characters are not just being laughed at, they are being turned into to peddlers to sell products to an unsuspecting pedals to an unsuspecting public. Consumers should boycott companies whose advertising continues to use these stereotypes. And so what we're doing is the paper was about stereotypes, about the particular ones that were out there, how they're not appropriate, and then how they're being used, and then the recommendation is we should boycott companies who advertise this way. It might work, might not, but it's a recommendation, and it's okay. You could show this. This often happens quite often. In a lot of our advertising, we see some silliness out there as well, but sometimes it's a lot more harmful than we think it is. Another one to think about too is we're going to start looking at our titles. Now, titles, I would recommend that as you move on, I would write the paper first and do the title last. Titles are something that you have to consider, but I think sometimes it's best to consider after you've wrote your conclusion. After you've got the paper written, you kind of have a more structured idea of what you want. And you could find a title that fits better. Some people like to have a title or a working title to begin with. It's really up to you. Here's a good one. Schools divide people into categories. From first grade on up, students are labeled as advanced or deprived or remedial or antisocial. And in particular, it did it again. This is a good example of a title. Okay, here we go. Brief summary. You have to summarize it. I don't know why it did that. I'm sorry, guys. brief summaries of what an essay is about, okay? So here's a good one here. I like this one. I'm not a consumer. I'm a victim. If I order a product, it is sure to arrive in the wrong color, size, or quantity. If I hire people to do repairs, they never arrive on the day scheduled. If I owe a bill, the computer is bound to overcharge me. Therefore, in self-defense, I have developed the following consumer's guide to complaining effectively. Now, ideas. Here is where you could think of some ideas. Well, what would you call a paper like this? What are some possible titles? And if you could talk about a victim's guide to consumer complaints. There are all kinds of things you could think of. And so it's better to sometimes wait till, as they always say, wait till all the facts are in. Wait till you've got the paper written. Now, again, it's up to you. It's not something you must do. It's something that's just advisable sometimes, simply because there's just no better way to do it. Another way to do this, too, is to think of, as we were talking about schools here, about how they pigeonhole people. Here's a good one. Schools divide people from first grade on up. Students are labeled as advanced, deprived, remedial, or antisocial. Students pigeonhole their fellow students. We put them in classes as well. We all know the jock, the brain, the dummy, the teacher's pet. And in most cases, these narrow labels are misleading. They're often inaccurate. But there is one label for a certain type of college student, and that is called zombie. Now, you're already thinking, what? What is a zombie? Well, I don't know. And he's going to tell you what it is, but he hasn't yet. So, from that, you could think of some possible titles for a work, for what this work might be. The new college student, the zombie. I know a zombie is a drink. So, think of some ideas of what you might call something like this. So again, once you've got your paper written and formed, that sometimes you can have a working title. Don't have to. There is no hard and fast rule about a title of when you have to have one, except that it should fit. Okay. Some things you don't want to do. You don't want to underline the title. You don't want to put quotation marks around it. You just increase the size, bold it. Don't do any of that. Put it in as it is on page 161 of the Little Seagull Handbook. Use that method. Just center it and use the same font and the same size font. There's no need to do any more of that in the MLA style. You should capitalize the first letter of all but the small connecting words in the title, except the first letter, except the first word. So words like the and words that you normally wouldn't capitalize elsewhere in a sentence, if it's the first word of the title, it gets capitalized. That's the only exception. If you were calling it the zombie, it would be capital T zombie, Z zombie. If it were the making of a zombie, it would be, the first one, capital THE, the M, capital M, making of small o, a, small a, zombie, capital Z, zombie. It's those important words, not those other important words like of and so forth, The other thing to keep in mind, too, is that now that you have your, and this is kind of a recap of some of the things that we've talked about. But now that you've got your paper and you've stated your thesis statement and you have a good idea, now you're going to provide supporting evidence. And what you've done is the thesis statement tells you in what order you're going to put the rest of this in the following paper. And so supporting evidence becomes important. Now that you've got this, you got to support it with your supporting paragraphs that explain and provides the details for the supporting your points. You're going to you want to make sure that your points have adequate support. You want to find, sometimes what you may have to do is you may have to develop sort of an informal outline. Write out a brief version of your thesis statement. That's really your outline. Write out this, work out, and jot down 3 points that will support your thesis. So and there's no, even though we live in this digital world, put it on your phone. Put it on a note section in your phone. Here's a rough scratch outline. Here, look at this. Do a rough scratch outline on your phone. You don't have to write it out on paper. You can. There's nothing that says you don't have to. But, put it out like this. The title of this work was normally Managing a Problem. And so what's the problem? We're talking about why is it such a problem going out to the movies, okay? And this person decided to had said that there are 3 main points to this problem. The inconvenience of going out, tempting snacks, and rude other moviegoers. These are the 3 main problems. Okay, so this scratch outline, it's simple. It doesn't have a lot of development, but it does require some thought behind it. So you have to really have some thought behind it. But once you plan these, you can then think about, as you're doing your research, you can think about, what kind of evidence do we have? What's so inconvenient about going out? What kind of evidence can I find from that to support my point here? What about tempting snacks? If somebody's on a diet, do they really want to, although, is popcorn really that good for you if you're on a diet? What about having to deal with other rude moviegoers, people who don't turn their phone off, people who talk, and so forth? So but the thing is once you've got this in order, okay, you now can prevent a lot of problems from your writing. As you start to write, you can you stop yourself in the middle of it and say, wait, did I talk about this already? I already talked about this. I don't need to talk about this again. Or transition from one point to the other very quickly and very easily, okay? Now, it's also important to have specific details. You've got to develop that thesis with at least 3 supporting points, and each point must be developed in specific detail, and that's what we've talked about. So each paragraph has specific details that are going to convince a reader. What's so inconvenient about going out? What do you have? What do you mean you have to worry about other moviegoers? Well, you got people that have to get up in the middle of a movie because they got to go to the bathroom. You got people who maybe talk during a movie. You got inconsiderate. You could do all kinds of things. There's other things that you can do. So you have to, each paragraph has to be specific. You have to engage, make sure you have the right evidence to convince your reader. And then there needs to be enough information that really convinces that reader. And there have to be some concrete examples provided. If you don't provide those examples, you're going to have a very weak point, and your reader's going to look at you and say, you really lost me here. Good details, sharp details are going to capture your interest and going to keep people, there to enable us to really look at the writer's experience or understand the writer's point of view. And they're going to provide, pictures in your mind, how each of us feel. I understand this. Going to the concession stand, not only do you have those terribly high prices, popcorn is really ridiculous, knowing how cheaply you can get it yourself at home, compared to, you're paying that much for popcorn. You gotta be kidding me. So, as you organize and connect this, you're going to connect that specific evidence with some details, okay? And so you want to provide enough specific details to support your point in your paragraphs. And the details have to be able to cohere, in other words, or stick to each other, so that your reader is going to be able to move from one point to another, from one point to the next. Common supporting details, okay? There are 3 things that we're going to talk about. Here are some of the common ones that are going to help you provide some things that will help. And these 3 things, of course, are common methods of organization, transitional phrases, and of course other connecting words, which are going to help develop this in important ways, okay? For example, there are certain kinds of specific details that you're going to want to have in order to have enough adequate detail, okay? So, some common methods, all right? There are the two most common methods for organizing are either through time order or emphatic order. Time order, we're talking about chronology, okay? If it were something historical, you want to keep the details in chronological order. If there's something that you're explaining, a procedure, you're going to want to keep things in order so that as they would occur in time. And you do this by using words like, first this is done, or then this happens, or after that we do this, and so on. Here's how you would do something with a work about exercising. And this is something that was put together by somebody in PE. To exercise successfully, a person should follow a simple plan consisting of arranging time, making preparations, and warming up properly. There's the order. This is the thesis statement for a paper. And here's the order. Boom, boom, boom. Okay? So, how are we going to put these in some kind of order? Well, we would start writing things out with the first thing that should be done is to set aside regular hour for exercise. Boom, a regular time. Next, preparations for the exercise session should take place. Finally, a series of warm-up activities should be completed. Smooth, one to the other. We know what happens first, we know what happens after that, and we know what the last thing is. And we have the order set up right here. Okay, and this is very good as far as setting up a time sequence. We've set up a time sequence and we're going to do this, this, and then this. Okay, and that makes absolute sense when you think about it. Whether, if you were going to instruct somebody how to drive, you would say, first you open the car door, or whatever, you would start with. The next thing is you want to keep what's called emphatic order. Now, emphatic order has to deal with emphasis, and that's what most of us are dealing with when we talk about issues in particular. You want to put emphasis on the most interesting, important detail, and it's the last part of a paragraph, or it's the last in the sequence, or the final supporting paragraph, or final supporting point of an essay. So, and you emphasize this by using words like last of all, or last and most important, or finally. Here's an example of an argument about celebrities that lead very stressful lives. And in this paper, there are three things. The first one thing, celebrities don't have the privacy or as ordinary people do. Okay. In addition, celebrities are under constant pressure. And most important, celebrities must deal with the stress of being in constant danger. Wow. Now, I bet that's not something you would think about. Certainly not something I would think about as far as, I mean, we think about that, but are celebrities really in danger? I'm going to be interested in this, because I want to know what they're talking about. Now, sometimes some essays are going to use a combination of both. Not always. So you've got to be careful. The next one we talk about are transitions. How do you move from one to the next? And this is where transitions are signals. These are words that we are using to tell people how this is connected. It adds flow to not just paragraphs, but from one sentence to the other within a paragraph. The one thing you have to be careful about is, though, don't overuse these. These are so easily overused, okay? But at the same time, you want to use enough so that it's important. And this kind of gives you the writer's going to give you a direction by doing this. So, how do we know about this? Okay, well, we have things like additional signals that talk about chronology, addition. You got one, first of all, second, the third reason, also, next, and in addition, moreover, furthermore, finally, last of all. These give additions, these give emphasis to particular points, they tell you what point we're talking about, and they give that help for that chronology. So, the first thing we're going to talk about is order. Okay, the first. Time signals, first, then, you can see some of these are interchangeable. meanwhile, soon, now, finally, space signals, and we're talking about signals that are talking about geographic space, across directions, opposite side, to the left, to the right, above, that give directions. If you're going to give directions like in an essay, they give you a sense of where we're going to be, where one might be. Change of direction, which is important too. This is all really good. However, wait a minute. You mean this isn't all really good? That, however, is an automatic, let's put the brakes on and whoa, what are we talking about here? In contrast, although otherwise still on the contrary, this doesn't really happen. Or on the other hand, so it helps, focus your work, but also show that there are other arguments out there too. In addition to, for example, we talked about the 3 ill effects on cyber media or social media, being, the false sense of body image, the increase in cyberbullying and mental health issues that all have been associated with it. But on the other hand, there are good parts to social media, and you could see that on the other hand, we're talking about other positive effects. Other things like illustration signals. For example, for instance, these are giving examples, illustrations of what your point is. Give a case study. If you're talking about an example of cyberbullying, say, Nora Jones had this problem. Boom, 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 boom. You found this, you're citing it, and so forth. Conclusions are very stark stopping points. Therefore, thus, as a result, in summary, to conclude, last of all, finally, in the end, these all show that this is the final concluding point and that how these all fit together. Transitions are very important. And you're going to want to, in the Little Seagull Handbook, there are a lot of phrases that are there. I'm just giving you a few here. There are lots of them that we can use. And these transitions help as far as being able to show that the importance of focusing and making those smooth moves from one paragraph to the next. You got to be careful not to overuse them, though, because overuse can be just as bad as underuse sometimes. Now, will you always get that right balance? After practice, you might. I know I always am accused of using probably too many. And so I try, very often I might use too many, and when I go back, I'll take them out, or I'll make it an addition. Remember, this is a process that is an ongoing process, which is hard, I know, but something to think about. Thank you. Transitional sentences. These are sentences that link between paragraphs. They try to tie things together. This is important because it enables the reader to move from one idea in one paragraph to another idea in the next paragraph, which is what you really, want to go for. And it's kind of important too. Here's a good question. Many of the patrons are even more of a problem than the concession stand. Okay, this is an example. You're thinking, what are we talking about? Well, in this sentence, the word concession stand would remind people of the point of the first supporting paragraph, which supposedly we just read. So while many other patrons present the point to be developed in the second supporting paragraph, you are linking it to what happened in the paragraph before. Okay, so if we were talking about problems at the concession stand, that people have during baseball games or whatever, we see that there are many other problems that patrons have. Or many other problems that patrons themselves are the problems than just working at the concession stand. Maybe they litter, or maybe they, whatever. So again, but what you're reminding your reader here of is the previous paragraph was talking about concession stands, and we're going to talk about the next problem and why it's just as bad or worse than the first one. And so it's a subtle way of connecting them together. And that does help as far as making those transitional sentences. We do this all the time when we write into paragraphs and we talk about particular points. So at this point, I'm going to leave this and we'll come back and talk about other things soon. Thank you very much.